What happens when AI becomes as fundamental to business as electricity and Wi-Fi? And what does that mean as we govern risk, ensure compliance and build trust at scale? Well, on today's episode, I'm going to reconnect with an old friend. We last spoke 5 years ago. He's the vice chairman and co-founder of MetricStream, which is a global leader in governance, risk and compliance. And the last time we spoke, the world was in lockdown. Zoom fatigue was peaking, GRC conversations were still largely about internal audits and regulatory checklists. Fast forward to today, and we're navigating a landscape that's transformed by generative AI. Geopolitical uncertainty, mounting regulatory pressure are just a few of the areas that have appeared since our last conversation. So today, I want to learn more about how AI is reshaping every layer of GRC, from real-time regulatory monitoring to predictive risk analytics, and how this shift is moving GRC from being a reactive process to something that's integrated into design of products and workflows right from the outset. So I invite you to join us as we explore together today how organisations are balancing innovation with accountability, and also what's at stake if they fall behind. So if you've ever find yourself wondering if your organisation is ready for a world where GRC is no longer a back office function, but a strategic lever for resilience and growth, and you came to the right place. But enough from me. Let's get today's guest on now. So a massive warm welcome back to the show. For anyone that missed our last conversation, can you remind the listeners with a little about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely, Neil. So first, very quickly about the company, and then I'll talk about myself. So MetricStream is a market leader in the space of governance, risk, and compliance, and it's defined in different ways, essentially. But more and more is coming under the garb and cover of GRC. When we spoke last, cyber was just emerging, if you will. But now, if you look at it, everything from operational risk to obviously the defense functions like internal audit and assurance to regulatory compliance, that has evolved quite a bit, through third-party management, cyber, and over the last couple of years, ESG as well. And we are seeing a spate of requirements now around the governance of AI itself, while AI is getting a lot of, momentum clearly, and it has to, just given the nature of the beast, basically. But there's also conversations on the governance of AI and how do you ensure that different aspects of AI are well governed, across different parameters. So MetricStream is a platform that provides, a full spectrum of risk management, governance, and compliance across all of these quote unquote risk themes. And that's how we've evolved. The second thing, personally, as you probably know from our last conversation, I'm one of the co-founders of MetricStream. We started the company almost 20 years ago. And I've played multiple roles, starting with the founding CFO, then the chief operating officer. Then for a period of 3 years, I was appointed as a chief executive officer, to ensure that the capital markets were shifting, and we had to ensure that we have a balanced growth and profitability. And more recently, just given the whole push on AI, I've taken on a role of the vice chairman, essentially focused on our customers and staying exceptionally close to the market right now in terms of our AI strategy overall. Because AI can be very exciting, but it can also disrupt, the markets quite a bit. So that's been the journey, Neil, so far.
Well, it's been 5 years since we last spoke, and the world was a very different place then. I was recording episodes on Skype. There was a pandemic about to arrive. And now on the call today, we've got several AI agents, which would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. So what's been keeping you busy since we last spoke?
So, Neil, I think the biggest thing I'd say is that the evolution and expectations of organizations on how and what to govern, how and what to comply with. And I think most importantly, how to manage risk by just not having risk as a defense function and mitigating risk, but organizations are evolving towards making risk a strategic priority, where, we are seeing a lot of companies, having good risk and infrastructures and risk management philosophies and frameworks that also are starting to allow them to look for opportunities versus just the flip side of risk, if you will, right?
Yeah.
Technology is evolving and has evolved quite a bit. The whole notion of how users interact with, risk management and governance, how administrators interact with it, how executives interact with it, that also has been keeping us busy because the expectations are changing quite rapidly. And particularly over the last year, as AI has become more real, as I mentioned earlier, the world of GRC, there was a little bit of what I call, a functional deficit in terms of companies thinking that they can't miss a single regulation or they cannot miss a single risk. Otherwise, it could lead to fines. It could lead to meltdowns in the organization or even systemic risk in the industry. But now with the volume, velocity of information that's coming in both inside and outside the firewalls of an organization, there is no option but to deal with, vast amounts of data, information, interpretations. Okay. And that's where, the advent of AI is becoming more real in these organizations. So with the change that's happening, Neil, for me, if you ask me what's keeping me busy is to ensure that we keep a very tight focus on the product market fit. Okay. Because these things are happening quite rapidly. And the second thing is ensuring that our customers, we stay extremely close to our customers in terms of both their expectation, but also the value that we can provide to them.
And I think if we were to compare our lives from when we last spoke to now, there's been so many big changes, and AI now is not only ubiquitous, it's embedded in daily life as much as electricity or Wi-Fi. So how is that reality? How have you seen that transforming the landscape of governance, risk and compliance? Because that's the flip side of the coin that everyone's starting to talk about now, right?
Yes. And Neil, I can talk about LLMs and, the other aspects of technology, but I'm going to flip this conversation to the other side, right?
Yeah.
So there are three big drivers. I would say that one is clearly, as I mentioned already, that speed and velocity of risk has changed dramatically with the volume, of data and information that's sitting, all across, right? Also, the speed and velocity of disruptions have changed, not just because of technology, but what's happening geopolitically, nationalization efforts, all of that stuff that's, going on, if you will, right? The second thing I would say is that, people have realized that the interdependency of risk is extremely high. So nothing is isolated. A 2 plus 2 could compound to a 10, not just a 4, if you will. If you look at any geopolitical event right now that's happening, an event could impact, a state sponsored cyber attack could impact your assets, could impact your operational technology, in a large oil and gas company or a bank, for example. So the ability for organizations to make sure that the interdependency is well calculated, well maneuvered has become even more important. But I will take you to something which is even more interesting, which might look and sound, kind of simplistic. But if you step back, in the world of GRC, if you look at it, there are close to 500 million people who interact with GRC globally at any point of time. And, you might ask, how did I come up with that calculation? In most organizations, I'm just taking companies that are, let's say, $100 million in revenue plus, right? Every employee of the organization, every extended enterprise member of the organization, whether it's in the supply chain or the demand chain, they are touching GRC in some capacity day in and day out. They're either filling up a cybersecurity assessment form, or they're doing an operational risk, or they're responding to an issue from an auditor or a regulator, etc. And just step back. It took me probably a few months after talking intensively to customers on what the real pain is. And the real pain is that these people, day in and day out, are filling up forms. Think about this for a second. If you're at your organization, some cybersecurity requirement comes in and you have to fill up a form saying, I'm prepared, I'm doing my assessments properly, etc. And they're spending hours, weeks, months. At one of the large banks that I talked to, there's 2,500 people who day in and day out are just filling up risk assessment forms across their operational risk and their compliance program. I'm not even extending it to other areas yet, right? So there is a screeching demand, from these enterprises to say, how can we make the lives easier for these people? And that's where the whole, kind of concept of a combination of generative and agentic AI comes in, where a person who's spending hours, weeks, months, full time, just quote unquote filling up assessment forms, okay, creating new risks or creating new controls, okay, and how do we make their lives easier through a combination of, like I said, generative, which is content generation, and agentic, which is, putting agents that actually can do most of the work. I absolutely do not believe that the human element of GRC is going to go away. But what we can do is make it easier for people to interact and for people to not do the rote routine work in GRC. And it just gets compounded because there are lots of people who are doing this on a day-to-day basis. And where we're heading is that through a combination of, generative and agentic, we are making lives easier for people so that they're not spending hours, they're spending minutes, while still retaining the human intellect to be able to provide the last bit of cover. So you can't automate everything because there's a lot of human intelligence, to assess, understand, and react to risk. Okay, that's the big change that, in my opinion, is going to happen in the world of GRC.
And the last time we spoke, President Trump was at the helm, and in the gap since we spoke, Biden came and went, and President Trump is now back in office, and there are early signs of deregulation. So I'm curious, from your point of view here, how are policy shifts beginning to reshape AI oversight? What are you seeing here?
So I think that's a great question, Neil. It may sound biased because we run a GRC company, but I'll tell you that whether it's regulations, whether it's the concept of risk frameworks, etc., they're here to stay.
Yeah.
Most organizations that you interact with, are global in nature, either directly because they have presence in, global countries, if you will, or there are interdependencies. Even if they're isolated in a country, they have interdependencies, whether through the financial system or through supply chains, etc., right? So my view here is that, while there will be discussions on deregulation, and you're seeing the current administration talking about deregulation, you are going to see global regulations kind of compete with each other. I've talked briefly about nationalization, where, even if you look at what's happening with, whether it's DeepSeek, whether it's India trying to create their own LLMs to, retain information in the country, regulations are still here to stay. They might be more provocative sometimes, but they're going to sometimes be conflicting as well, because an organization that operates in global countries, they will be exposed to whether it's an EU act or it's coming from Singapore. We're seeing the Middle East ramp up quite a bit in terms of their governance models on whether it's AI or newer technologies like crypto or, blockchain, etc. So I do feel that while, there might be attempts on deregulation, you are not going to see necessarily a reduction in stance overall as organizations prepare for this. The second thing I'd say here is that in the case of AI particularly, since we are talking about it, okay, there are also going to be self-governance and industry-based governance that will sometimes leapfrog even the regulatory governance, if you will, right? And, I was speaking to somebody very recently as top executive at a global bank with 80,000 employees globally. And, one of the things that came out was that the tolerance for errors is going to be pretty low, okay, on AI. So, for example, if you look at when, Tesla first got launched, or we have Waymo, the self-driving cars, okay, in San Francisco that are buzzing around, the tolerance for a small accident is so low because they're self-driven, and you could have a, huge number of what I call accidents that might be manual. But when it comes to AI driven cars, as an example, quote unquote, okay, the tolerance is so low that what will happen is, or what is continuing to happen is that the self-governance from organizations putting the right frameworks in place, because if something goes wrong, then the whole, the positive side of AI can get impacted very quickly. People will put a clamp down in. So I do feel that self-governance, industry-based governance, and regulatory governance, combination of these will continue to, ensure that it doesn't go out of whack, basically, the whole innovation side of the equation, if that makes sense, Neil.
It really does. And there is so many big changes happening here. And it's interesting to see how it's all taking shape on both sides of the pond as well. But how are you seeing AI changing the day-to-day work of GRC teams, particularly in areas like real-time regulatory tracking, predictive risk analysis? Because I think sometimes we focus on the shiny and exciting, but this stuff is equally as important, if not more so, right?
Absolutely, Neil. And I'll tell you, I'm going to take two examples because that will probably bring things to life.
Yeah.
One part of AI is all about efficiency creation. If you look at the world of GRC, regulatory compliance or risk, companies have invested in it quite a bit out of fear, if you will, right? Nobody wants to have a control loss or some regulation not being met. And therefore, over time, organizations have poured in a lot of what I call human dependencies, consulting, etc., to be able to take care of that, right? Now, I'll give you an example at a bank that we work with, okay, a sizable bank in North America, okay, they had over time proliferated and they are literally testing. I'm making it very technical here, but not really. They test 40,000 controls on a quarterly, weekly, annual, semi-annually, 40,000 of them in one single group. My extrapolation on that is that they could be testing 100,000 risks and controls, and they have hundreds, if not thousands of people doing this on a daily basis, right? There's terabytes of information. Now, this company, we actually launched, something called Aspire a couple of years ago, where it can go and look at all your risk and control environment and start to rationalize where the redundancies are, duplicative efforts, where there are surrogates that can be used not to do over testing of your compliance requirements, all of that stuff. And we found that literally 30% of their overall controls, okay, were being either redundantly tested for no reason. The risks were being assessed where there was no need to assess risks because it was coming from legacy. So the first bastion there, and you're talking now about several hundred people that were rerouted in this organization to more revenue generating functions there, right? So that's the efficiency piece. Part of the efficiency piece is also the quality of life. You've got these PhDs and you've got these very, what I call capable and well-educated people who are just doing rote work day in and day out. So the life is going to change for them where, the rote work can be done by agents, but they're bringing in their intellectual capabilities to provide insights and recommendations versus trying to do day-to-day work, right? That's one part of what I call the efficiency side of AI. Let me give you another example where an energy company that has physical assets, global assets, digital assets across their organization, they were finding it very difficult to figure out where their emerging risks are lying. So as an example, there could be a coup in an African country that can impact their physical assets because they're an oil-producing country, right? Or there could be a threat on a oil rig, basically a cyber attack on an oil rig. Or there could be political issues where, ransomware is happening, not just cyber-wise, but physical ransomware is also happening. Now, what we've been able to do with this organization as an example is to be able to, which was not possible in the past, able to get what I call signals, cutting out of noise from external, internal data sources at scale and bring it to the level of the chief risk officer and the CFO and the CIO, saying that your emerging risks are happening here, and this could be related to their operations technology. It could be related to their IT or, human assets that they have across the world. But ability to actually look at emerging risks was tough in the past, right? Because you could collect the data. It would sometimes take 5 or 6 months basically to collect that data and bring it to, where the risks are actually emerging essentially. So Neil, all this is starting to change where on one side, efficiency, creation and quality of life of the GRC practitioners. And on the other side, just expanding the canvas of where risks could be lurking and bringing it to bear within a matter of minutes, hours versus months that used to happen in the past, Neil, if that helps.
And I'm curious, as businesses increasingly race to adopt AI across their operations, anything else you're seeing around the biggest GRC challenges that people are coming to you and asking for your help with or talking about? What you're hearing here?
I would say that what I'm hearing from, a lot of particularly enterprises, right? When I say enterprises, not very small companies, but, mid to large companies.
Yeah.
I think there are two or three things that are emerging. Number one, that they are worried about, how to protect the privacy, the data, the explainability, and the observability of information. They're very excited, but they are putting certain boundary walls in terms of how they adopt it because of reasons that I just mentioned, right? So they're moving fast in trying to figure out how to balance innovation and trust, if I may call it, right? But their biggest concern right now in adoption, okay, and the way I talk is that there's a lot of toys right now, if you will, in AI. People are coming up with fantastically, what I call, great quote unquote products in a POC mode, in a proof of concept mode. But when you start to have a large organization adopt it, the biggest quote unquote fear right now is that, are we doing something that can harm us versus, can help us get to the next level of innovation, of efficiency, and of, of the canvas and expansion that I talked about, right? So that's the one thing that I'm hearing. And we're trying to ensure that, the trust in AI, is established so that they can use, they can actually bolster the outcomes and the value that they're getting from this, right? That's number one. The second thing that I would say is that, in terms of what we're hearing is that, there is a human factor involved, right? Everybody is fully aware. If you look at some of the largest tech companies, they're laying off people, there's human impact, etc. So they're trying to balance the human impact of, of the efficiency. And that's a worry for them, right? On how far do they go? Because humans have accumulated a lot of intellectual property over time. How much of that can get into the world of AI, and how much do they retain? So it's a little subtle, but it's not really subtle, if you know what I mean, Neil. That's the two big things I would say that is emerging outside of the excitement of really a new paradigm of how they manage GRC.
And just to highlight the dangers of enterprises doing absolutely nothing here, what would you say are the risks that those companies face if they fall behind in modernizing their compliance frameworks to account for AI-driven processes? Because it can be very easy and a dangerous trap to fall into, to get the new shiny tech in. Let's just go forward and worry about the other stuff later. It's a very dangerous and risky strategy to play, isn't it?
Yes, and Neil, both. I'll talk about both the flip side, as you mentioned. One,
Yeah.
Let me actually start with what is the risk of not adopting it, right?
Yeah.
Not adopting it, you have, every company is dealing with primarily stakeholders like their shareholders, like boards, like, their customers, of course. And then there is the employee base, right? Not adopting it, has a clear threat or a risk of falling behind competitively, because new products are being launched in a matter of like weeks versus months and years that used to happen earlier. And if you fall behind, okay, you have a problem of competitiveness. You have a problem of shareholder value. We are seeing, stock prices kind of, of AI first companies. You're seeing the stock market right now, despite all the turmoil, it's the AI first companies that are actually getting the value proportionately, on their shareholder value, if you will, right? So there's a clear threat that they can fall behind in terms of primarily competitiveness, if you will, right? Number one.
Yeah.
On the flip side, the risk really is, like I mentioned earlier, the sensitivity on AI is very high, which means that, if something is biased, okay, if something is not accurate, if it is not contextual, that your AI, whether it's an agent or, through the combination of ML and agentic AI, what comes to the table, if it's not contextual, it's not reasonably accurate, and it doesn't have the traceability, okay, there is a risk of, getting stamped and stomped, and these projects or these initiatives getting paused because of, both the social impact, but also the business impact of what can happen with this, Neil.
And finally, if we dare to look into the future, especially as AI will inevitably continue to evolve, what do you see as the next major frontier for GRC and risk leaders? What should they be preparing for?
So, Neil, that's a great question again. And I feel that two things. One, every industry will have a slightly different take or how they go about it to get the maximum benefits. I want to go into details of every industry, but the way a banking looks at it, the way, insurance looks at it, okay, the way energy company or a healthcare company looks at it, there'll be nuances on what is going to be most important for them to adopt, is going to be slightly different by industry or the sector, if you will. But if I take it at a lowest common denominator, I would say that there are three primary things that I'd focus on or at least recommend to my customers who are adopting this at scale, right? Increasingly, I would say that we've got to put GRC by design into their normal day-to-day workflows, their product design, their supply chain design, okay, versus doing it post-facto. GRC for a long time has been a post-facto assurance process that once the process is over, test out whether they're doing the right things, do the audit, okay, conduct their risk assessments, okay, conduct the supply chain, assessments, get the insights. But more and more, GRC has to be in design, which means when you're designing your new product, when you're designing your current product, when you're doing the digitization, it has to be as preventative, okay, in terms of as detective, if you will, right? So that's one piece here. The other thing I would always, guide is that try to focus on small wins. Don't focus on what I call boiling the ocean, because these enterprises are well embedded in the culture that they've had for decades. They're well embedded in processes. So the most important thing would be to actually get smaller wins, focus on simplicity of the wins versus trying to, really kind of overturn the entire process, organization, digitization process. And that will allow more adoption and more, buy-in from the rest of the organization and even from people outside the organization, whether it's regulators, whether it's stakeholders, etc. So give smaller wins basically versus trying to boil the ocean overall, right? So I would say that that's the two things. One is just getting GRC by design. And second is, really kind of focusing on smaller wins. It may not be significant, but get smaller wins that allows more belief that the outcomes are going to be, critical. And the third thing I would say is that always, focus on innovation, but also focus on the governance aspects, because the tolerance is going to be low and you don't want to stop short on your path to innovation just because something didn't work accurately or contextually.
Well, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast, sharing your insights today. So much food for thought, so much gold hidden in there. And I'm going to see if there's something we can do for you now, because some of the biggest names in business, VC funding and tech have either been guests or maybe even listened to this podcast, or maybe they know a guy that knows a guy that listens. So let's see what we can manifest together here. Is that a person you'd love to have a private breakfast or lunch with? Who would it be and why? Let's hope he or she might just get to hear this, but who would it be and why?
So Neil, one, clearly, like I said, Donald Trump would be one, okay, President Trump, okay, because there's so much happening and there's so much power being wielded. It'll be good to get in the head, right? That I would say that definitely, would be one person. And, if there's a second person, I would say that, the second person, it might look obvious, okay, but it's a combination of Sam Altman and Elon Musk, because, they are thinking, okay, a few generations ahead, if you will, right? And, both the downside and the upside of what they're doing, they're smart people and just getting into the head, with the kind of investments they're pouring in, they also understand the downsides of AI quite well. And because AI is thematic right now, those would be, probably the three people. Now, these seem to be very obvious and may not be as interesting, Neil, to you, but, but that's the ones that probably are top of mind right now.
Wow, if we could get all three of those in the same room, it will certainly be interesting. There'll be a few sparks flying there. Well, let's see what we can do. We'll throw that into the universe, see what we can manifest there. And for anyone listening, just wanting to find out more information about you and your work and some of the insights you've shared today and the work you're doing at MetricStream, where would you like to point everyone listening?
So Neil, my email address is very simple. It's my first name, Gaurav @metricstream.com. Okay, that could be the first place. And of course, our website and all of that stuff is there, but that could be the first one.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. We talked about so much, and just looking at our conversation there, talking about how AI is revolutionizing GRC, from real-time regulatory monitoring to predictive risk analytics, what recent deregulation from the new administration could mean for businesses and compliance leaders, and what companies are risking should they fall behind in adapting, as AI is now embedded into just about everything from risk assessment to compliance. And when I compare what we've talked about today to our conversation 5 years ago, it really is quite telling on just how far AI has come. But more than anything, just thank you for shining a light on this. Thanks again.
Thank you, Neil. And as always, a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you for all the work that you're doing as well.
What are companies really risking if they delay embedding AI into their GRC strategy? I think my guest made it clear today. The answer spans far beyond compliance. It's about competitiveness, reputation, and the ability to move at the speed of today's global economy. And in the episode, we heard how GRC is evolving into something far more dynamic. Instead of just being an afterthought or a check-the-box process, it's actually becoming embedded by design into core business functions that are guided by the data-rich capabilities of AI. So from helping organisations manage 40,000 plus controls more intelligently, to even identifying geopolitical risks in real time. The tools and the strategies that we discussed today, they're not theoretical, they're already in use. But the success of them, well, that depends on trust. And building trust requires companies to rethink everything from the structure of their teams to the quality of their data. But as my guest said, it's best to focus on small, measurable wins, because they're the things that are going to offer a pragmatic starting point for businesses that are navigating this transition. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Techblogwriter at outlook.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes. Let me know your thoughts, and we'll continue this conversation. But that's it for today, so thank you for listening as always, and I will speak with you all again very, very soon. Bye for now.